The courtroom was filled with an air of quiet expectation. No one quite knew what was about to happen, but everyone could feel that something big was coming. Michael Jordan, a man who had spent decades facing pressure on the basketball court, now found himself in an entirely different kind of battle. As he walked into the courthouse, dressed in a sharp suit, his mind was focused on the routine business hearing ahead, but as he moved toward the defendant's table, a single glance from the judge shifted the atmosphere. Judge Thomas Andrews, known for his strict demeanor, wasn't looking at Jordan's face or his suit. He was staring at something much smaller but far more significant, the gold cross resting around Jordan's neck. "Mr. Jordan," the judge's voice broke the silence, sharp as a blade, "I must remind you that religious symbols have no place in my courtroom." What followed was a moment no one expected. A simple piece of jewelry, a symbol of faith, would soon spark a confrontation that would challenge not just courtroom rules, but personal freedoms, constitutional rights, and the integrity of one of the most iconic athletes of all time. Would Michael Jordan bow to the judge's authority? Or would he fight to defend his rights in a way that no one could have predicted? The conflict. As Michael Jordan made his way to the defendant's table, he felt the weight of the room pressing down on him. Not because of the high-profile business dispute at hand, but because of something much subtler. His eyes briefly met those of Judge Thomas Andrews, a man known for his stern, unwavering authority. But it wasn't Michael's face that the judge was focused on. It was the simple gold cross hanging around his neck. The judge's gaze lingered, sharp and pointed, as though Jordan's faith was an offense in itself. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Judge Andrews leaned forward, his voice cutting through the stillness like a judge's gavel. "Mr. Jordan," he began, his tone calm but firm, "I must remind you that religious symbols have no place in my courtroom." Michael, undeterred, didn't flinch. He had seen opponents try to break him down before, but never in such an insidious way. This wasn't a basketball game, where physical strength and mental toughness could win the day. This was a battle of personal conviction, a fight for something that couldn't be measured in points or victories. This was a battle for freedom. The judge's next words were even sharper. "Remove it," he commanded, as if the small gold cross was somehow an offense to the very fabric of justice itself. "Or face a fine." But Jordan, even in the face of this unexpected confrontation, didn't budge. His hands remained steady, gripping the edge of the table as he met the judge's eyes, unwavering. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," he replied, his voice calm but resolute. "But this cross is a part of who I am, just as a wedding ring or a family locket might be for others. It is my faith, and it won't be taken off." The room shifted. The tension between the judge's authority and Michael's right to express his personal beliefs was now undeniable. The silence grew heavier, punctuated only by the sound of the judge's exasperated sigh. "Either remove it, or I will fine you." And in that moment, it wasn't just about a fine. It was about more than a piece of jewelry. It was about standing up for something much bigger than a courtroom rule. It was about personal identity, faith, and the strength to defend those beliefs in the face of those who sought to silence them. Jordan's heart raced, but his mind was clear. The battle had shifted from a simple business hearing to a constitutional challenge. The question was no longer whether he could win the case at hand, but whether he would be allowed to maintain his integrity, no matter the cost. The legal battle begins. With the judge's words hanging heavily in the air, Michael Jordan could feel the shift in the courtroom, the weight of expectation and tension pressing on him. He had won championships in front of thousands, faced the fiercest opponents, and lived through the harshest scrutiny. But here, in this sterile courtroom, the stakes were different. This wasn't about basketball. This wasn't about endorsement deals or media headlines. This was about something far more personal. It was about defending his right to exist authentically in a space where he wasn't just seen as a famous athlete, but as a human being with his own beliefs and values. The moment hung between them. The judge's insistence that Jordan remove the cross and Jordan's refusal. The fine was not the point, not really. Michael Jordan understood that more than anyone. The fine, in its essence, wasn't about money. It was about control. It was a message: conform or face consequences. But Jordan was no stranger to overcoming adversity, and this was no different. He had battled much greater challenges throughout his life and career, but none of them had ever tried to strip away his very sense of self. "I respectfully disagree, Your Honor," Jordan said, his voice steady, though his mind was moving at lightning speed. He wasn't just trying to get out of a fine, he was building the foundation for a much larger fight. "This cross, for me, is not just a symbol. It's a part of who I am. A piece of my faith that doesn't conflict with this court or its proceedings. I don't ask that my right to express them be respected." Judge Andrews leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Jordan, this court must remain neutral, and you are clearly defying that neutrality." Jordan paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in, not in defiance, but in the quiet realization that this was not just a question of a simple accessory. This was about challenging the idea that personal freedom could be restricted because it was inconvenient or uncomfortable for the powerful few. His shoulders squared as he addressed the judge once more, this time with a clarity born from years of self-discipline and quiet resolve. "Your Honor, the Constitution does not take a recess just because a courtroom feels uncomfortable with my personal expression," Jordan said, the words almost flowing naturally as they left his lips. "The First Amendment guarantees the freedom of speech, and that includes the freedom to practice one's religion, especially in spaces where we are supposed to be equal before the law." The judge's face remained unreadable, but the room seemed to hold its breath. Jordan could feel the gravity of the moment. He wasn't just making a point about his own rights, he was standing up for something much more universal. This wasn't just about him wearing a cross. This was about all Americans being able to express their beliefs, no matter the setting. "I'll be filing an objection, Your Honor," Jordan continued, his gaze unwavering, "and I'd like to state my argument on record." Judge Andrews barely blinked, but there was a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. "You may proceed," he said, his voice clipped, clearly annoyed by the disruption. As Jordan carefully unpacked his case, his mind began to draw from the deep well of knowledge he had acquired not just through sports but through his life's journey. He understood the stakes now. This wasn't a fight he could afford to lose, not just for himself, but for the values he held dear. The values that had made him who he was. He had always been someone who fought for his own path, his own identity, and this was no different. As he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a piece of paper, the weight of what he was about to do settled over him. This wasn't just a simple objection. He wasn't just challenging the fine. He was challenging the very idea that someone's personal beliefs should be silenced for the sake of neutrality. The paper, a carefully prepared argument based on constitutional law, would make the case clear. Wearing a cross didn't violate courtroom neutrality. It didn't disrupt proceedings. It was simply a reflection of who he was, just as a wedding ring or family locket might be for others. He set the paper down on the table in front of him, every movement deliberate, every second of silence adding pressure to the judge's growing uncertainty. "Your Honor," Jordan began, "let's break this down, shall we? I'm being fined for wearing a cross which you claim violates courtroom neutrality, but let's talk legal precedent. I refer to Tinker v. Des Moines, a landmark case that established that personal rights do not vanish when we enter a government space. Whether it's a school, a courtroom, or a public space, our freedoms are protected." The silence in the room deepened. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, waiting to record the words that were about to turn the tide. Jordan wasn't done. "And then, of course, there's West Virginia State Board of Education v. Barnett," he continued, his voice unshaken. "In that case, the Supreme Court ruled that compelling individuals to remove or conceal symbols of their personal beliefs is a direct violation of their First Amendment rights." The judge shifted uncomfortably. His mind raced, trying to process the legal weight of Jordan's argument. But it was already clear Jordan had put him on the defensive. He wasn't just facing an athlete here. He was facing a man who understood the law, who knew how to read between the lines and challenge authority when it was unjust. The room was now charged, each person in it feeling the tension between the judge's power and Jordan's resolve. The judge knew in that moment that he was losing control, and yet his pride still held him back from conceding. Jordan's words hung in the air, and the question now wasn't whether he could win this case. It was whether Judge Andrews could accept the reality of what was happening in front of him. The constitutional challenge. As the tension in the room continued to build, Michael Jordan could feel the weight of his words settling heavily in the air. He had drawn a line in the sand, and there was no turning back now. What had started as a dispute over a cross, an object as small as a simple necklace, had evolved into a larger, more significant confrontation. This wasn't just about his personal expression anymore. This was about the very foundation of the rights and freedoms that defined the country he loved. It was about whether the law could be manipulated to stifle one's beliefs, and whether personal freedoms could be sacrificed on the altar of authority. Jordan wasn't just challenging a fine, he was challenging the very nature of how rights were being interpreted and applied in this courtroom. He had taken a stand, and the consequences of that stand were far-reaching. This wasn't just about him. This was about everyone who walked into that courtroom. This was about the principle that no one should be forced to hide or remove symbols of their identity, faith, or values simply because it might make someone else uncomfortable. "Your Honor," Jordan said, his voice unwavering yet filled with an underlying gravity, "you've told me that this cross violates courtroom neutrality, but what I want to know is this. Where in the law does it say that my faith, my beliefs, can be stripped away the moment I walk into this room? Where does it say that my right to wear this cross should be diminished simply because I'm in your courtroom?" The room fell silent, every pair of eyes trained on Judge Andrews. Jordan's words were not just a challenge to the fine. They were a challenge to a system that too often took liberties with people's freedoms. He wasn't speaking just for himself. He was speaking for anyone who had ever felt the sting of having their beliefs judged and diminished in the name of neutrality. The very idea that personal expression could be regulated so easily was one that Jordan could not accept, not in the country he had always believed in. Jordan wasn't just taking a legal stance here. This was personal. His faith had shaped him throughout his life, not just in his career, but in his family, his community, and his legacy. To have that silenced, even in the smallest way, was an affront not only to him, but to everything he had fought for in his career. On the basketball court, he had always been an example of defiance against the odds, of pushing back against those who underestimated him, and now, here he was, doing the same thing once again, but in a completely different arena. "You say that this court must remain neutral," Jordan continued, his words measured and deliberate. "But neutrality doesn't mean silencing personal beliefs. It means respecting them. In fact, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution guarantees that I, like every citizen, have the right to freely express my religion, my beliefs, and my identity, especially in a space like this." The judge's face was unreadable, but the shift in his posture told a different story. Jordan had struck a nerve. It wasn't that the judge was unfamiliar with the Constitution, or that he hadn't heard arguments like this before. It was that Jordan was invoking principles that had stood the test of time, principles that could not be easily dismissed with the wave of a gavel. Jordan was relentless now, tapping the piece of paper in front of him as he brought up key legal precedents. "Let me remind you, Your Honor, of Tinker v. Des Moines Independent Community School District," he said, referencing a 1969 case that had been landmark in defending personal rights within public spaces. In that case, the Supreme Court ruled that students do not lose their constitutional rights to freedom of speech when they enter a public school. And what is this courtroom if not a public space where the law is meant to serve the people? The judge shifted, visibly uncomfortable. He knew the case well. Tinker was a foundational decision in the protection of free speech and religious expression. But even then, his pride fought against conceding. His authority in the courtroom was something he held tightly to, and now, in the face of Jordan's firm but calm challenge, it was slipping. "Let's take it a step further," Jordan continued, not missing a beat. "In West Virginia State Board of Education v. Barnett, 1943, the Supreme Court ruled that forcing individuals to remove or hide symbols of their personal beliefs violates the First Amendment. The court determined that no one, whether a student in school or a citizen in a courtroom, should be compelled to surrender their religious beliefs in the name of neutrality." Each word felt like a deliberate strike, a reminder to Judge Andrews that neutrality didn't mean oppression. It didn't mean silencing people because their beliefs made others uncomfortable. It meant fairness, respect, and, above all, freedom. Jordan's voice was steady as he concluded, "Your Honor, I understand the need for decorum in this courtroom, but I also know that decorum doesn't come at the cost of my rights. My cross doesn't disrupt these proceedings. It's not a distraction. It's simply part of who I am. I would like to know, with all due respect, what legal precedent you are using to justify this fine." The question hung in the air like a challenge. The judge, his face tight with frustration, didn't immediately respond. His silence was telling. In that moment, Jordan wasn't just presenting a case. He was inviting the judge to reflect on the very foundation of his authority. Could it stand up to the Constitution? Could it withstand the challenge of someone who was unwilling to let personal rights be trampled, no matter the cost? As Jordan waited, the weight of the moment settled in. This wasn't just about winning or losing. This was about sending a message that the Constitution was not to be bent or ignored, no matter the setting. It was about standing firm in the face of authority that sought to silence people for who they were. And Michael Jordan, in that moment, was making it clear he would not be silenced. The turning point. The courtroom was no longer just a space for legal proceedings. It had transformed into an arena where ideals were being tested, where principles of justice, freedom, and authority collided. Michael Jordan's calm, unwavering challenge to the judge's authority had shifted the dynamics. What began as a seemingly small issue, a fine for wearing a cross, had now become a reflection of something far larger, the delicate balance between personal freedoms and institutional control. As the silence stretched on after Jordan's powerful argument, the tension in the room became almost palpable. Judge Andrews, despite his usual commanding presence, had been pushed into a corner. The gavel, usually a symbol of power and decisiveness, now seemed like a lifeless object in his hand. The room waited with bated breath as the judge, a man accustomed to being in control, struggled to regain his footing. Jordan stood tall, his eyes fixed not on the judge's face, but on the weight of the principle at stake. His mind, sharp and focused, had already dissected the judge's arguments. He knew that this wasn't just about the cross, this was about something deeper. It was about the erosion of personal freedoms in the face of authority, the subtle ways in which individuals could be forced into conformity. He wasn't just defending his right to wear a cross, he was defending the very essence of his identity and the rights of every person who dared to express themselves authentically. Judge Andrews rubbed his temples, his frustration growing. His authority was slipping. He had expected Jordan to back down. He had expected the star athlete to be intimidated by the weight of his position, to comply with the rules set before him. But Jordan had done what no one expected. He had stood his ground. He had refused to be silenced, not out of defiance, but out of a deep, unshakable belief in the principles that undergirded the very foundation of the nation. "You're not just fighting a fine, Mr. Jordan," the judge said, his voice hoarse and edged with frustration. "You're fighting an issue that goes beyond this courtroom." Jordan met his gaze with quiet resolve, unflinching. "I'm fighting for what's right, Your Honor. This isn't about breaking the rules. This is about standing up for the values that this country was built on. And if the court cannot uphold those values, then what are we truly protecting here?" His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of centuries of struggle for freedom and rights. The judge's face twitched. For the first time, his stern expression wavered. Jordan wasn't just challenging the fine, he was questioning the very legitimacy of the judge's actions. And in doing so, he was forcing everyone in that room to confront a question that went beyond legalities. What was the cost of allowing authority to trample personal freedoms, even in the smallest ways? The judge shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly rattled by Jordan's unyielding stance. He had expected a quick, compliant resolution. He had expected Jordan to accept the fine, to go quietly into the night, to let the system continue to operate as it always had. But Jordan had forced him to rethink his own interpretation of authority and neutrality. He had forced him to confront a painful truth, that true neutrality could never come at the expense of someone's identity, faith, and rights. "Are you saying," Judge Andrews finally asked, his voice quieter, less certain, "that wearing a cross in a courtroom is a matter of constitutional rights?" Jordan's reply was steady and sure, the same quiet confidence that had carried him through countless challenges on the basketball court. "Yes, Your Honor, that's exactly what I'm saying. The Constitution protects my right to wear a cross, just as it protects my right to speak, to act, and to believe freely." The judge's jaw tightened. His pride, once unshakable, was beginning to crack. He had assumed that his position as the presiding judge would automatically make his decision final, that Jordan would simply comply with his directive. But now he was confronted with the reality of what was at stake. The foundation of the courtroom, built on respect for the law, was now under scrutiny. Could he justify the fine without overstepping his bounds? Could he stand by a decision that might violate the very rights he was sworn to protect? The room was completely still. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air, and then, finally, the silence was broken by a decision that no one had expected. "The fine is rescinded," Judge Andrews muttered, his voice strained. "But this does not mean that the issue is resolved. I expect future proceedings to follow the decorum set forth by the court." Jordan nodded, acknowledging the decision, but he knew this wasn't the end. His victory, though significant, was only a small part of a larger conversation. The real battle had just begun, not in this courtroom, but in the minds of those who would see the ruling and hear the story. The fine might have been rescinded, but the conversation around the right to express personal beliefs in the face of authority had only just started. As Jordan gathered his things, the realization set in. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, pushed into submission, or made to feel that their beliefs were secondary to the needs of authority. Michael Jordan had just fought for something much bigger than a cross or a courtroom rule. He had fought for the very essence of what it meant to be free. And in that moment, he knew that, no matter what came next, he had already won. The fight for freedom, for expression, for identity, it wasn't something that could be taken away by a judge, a fine, or a gavel. It was a fight that lived within him, within everyone who dared to stand tall in the face of adversity, no matter the odds. The resolution. The final words of the judge echoed through the room, but they didn't land with the finality of victory that many might expect. "The fine is rescinded," Judge Andrews muttered, the weight of his decision clearly weighing on him. His voice was thin, edged with the frustration of a man who had been caught in his own misstep, yet too proud to fully acknowledge the depth of the situation. For Michael Jordan, the moment didn't feel like a simple legal victory. It felt like a quiet triumph of principle. The courtroom had shifted from a battle over a trivial fine to a larger confrontation between power and freedom. Jordan had walked in expecting to face a business dispute, but he had walked out having made a stand. Not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been silenced by those in power, who had ever felt their personal freedoms restricted for no reason other than someone else's discomfort or control. But even as the fine was rescinded, Jordan knew the real challenge was far from over. The judge may have backed down in this moment, but the implications of his actions were not going to disappear. This wasn't a courtroom that simply handed out decisions and moved on. It was a stage for something much more significant. The fine may have been lifted, but the underlying message the judge tried to send was not easily erased. Jordan paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, not out of obligation, but out of a deep understanding of what had just happened. He wasn't thanking the judge for letting him off the hook. He was acknowledging the larger message, one that had shaken the foundation of the court's authority. But this isn't just about a fine. It's about freedom, the right to be who I am, no matter where I am. As he stood up to leave, the courtroom seemed to sigh with relief, but also with something else, something more profound. There was a new awareness in the air, a shift in the dynamic. The legal battle was over. But what had just happened was far more than a simple courtroom drama. It was a reminder of the quiet battles we all fight every day. The fight for identity, for expression, for faith, and for the freedoms that too often go unchallenged until they are taken away. Outside the courtroom, the immediate aftermath was a flurry of activity. News outlets picked up the story, social media exploded with reactions, and legal experts began to dissect the implications of what had unfolded. But for Jordan, none of that mattered, not as much as what had happened in that room. He had always known the weight of public scrutiny, but this time the stakes felt different. This wasn't about winning a championship or securing another endorsement deal. It was about defending something much more lasting: his integrity, his belief, and his right to live authentically. Jordan knew that the media circus surrounding this case would likely die down in time, but the real impact was the ripple effect it would have on others. People would hear the story and perhaps find the courage to stand up for their own rights. whether in a courtroom or in their everyday lives. Jordan's quiet defiance in that courtroom was a reminder that change doesn't always come from grand gestures or sweeping movements. Sometimes change starts with a single individual standing firm, speaking out and refusing to let the weight of authority dictate who they are. The decision to rescind the fine may have been a small victory in a larger system, but it was one that reverberated far beyond the courtroom. For Jordan, it wasn't about the fine, the headlines, or the praise. It was about making sure that others who found themselves in similar situations understood that they too had a right to speak their truth, to express their beliefs, and to stand up against any force that would try to suppress them. As Jordan stepped out of the courthouse, the weight of his actions settled in. He had done something profound, something that went beyond personal pride. He had sent a message to the world that even in the face of power, even in the face of those who would try to silence you, standing up for what's right was worth more than any fine, any legal battle, or any public opinion. The real victory lay in the quiet strength of standing firm. And as the media frenzy continued to swirl around him, Jordan knew that the real test was not what happened in the courtroom. It was what happened next. The ripple effects of this moment would be felt not just in the legal system, but in every person who would walk into that courtroom, and any courtroom, and feel empowered to stand their ground. For Michael Jordan, this was not just a personal victory, it was a message to all those who had ever been afraid to speak up, to express themselves, to stand firm in their beliefs. You are not alone. Your rights are worth defending and your voice matters. And as long as there are those willing to stand for truth and justice, the fight for personal freedoms will never truly be over. The aftermath. The story quickly spread beyond the courtroom. News outlets, social media, and legal commentators dissected what had just transpired. But for Michael Jordan, the significance wasn't in the headlines. It was in the quiet understanding that his stand for personal freedom had the power to inspire others. The fine may have been rescinded, but the message was clear. When you stand firm in your beliefs, you change the narrative. This wasn't just about one man's fight. It was about everyone's right to be true to themselves. And though the world would move on, Jordan's example would linger, reminding all of us that we must never let authority silence our identity. If you believe in standing up for what's right, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. How would you have handled the situation? Let's keep this conversation going and inspire change together.